One of the things that I have experienced in podcasts, one gimmick is, would this be classified as a gimmick? Is like something from the show or something just from the conversation or whatever that is like a cute little funny quip or something. Like you just play that and then the music starts. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Cult Favorite, the podcast hosted by two professors who won't ever leave everything and go undercover to study a UFO cult. I'm Erin Simmons. I mean, so, spoiler alert, we're talking about Heaven's Gate today. I'm so excited. And one of the people who studied them was a sociology professor who actually did leave everything and go underground to... Yeah, he was home by Christmas, but I know, right? Yeah. What is his teaching load? No. These are the questions that we need answers to. We get to talk about Heaven's Gate, which is, I think, one of those groups who get brought to mind when people do some kind of like free association of like, what do you think of when you think of cult? And Heaven's Gate is one of those groups that pops to mind. So the Cult of Cults. So the HBO documentary specifically that we were talking about, because probably there are several, is Heaven's Gate, the Cult of Cults. So like how much more culty can you get, really? No more culty. So what did you know about Heaven's Gate before then?
Heaven's Gate was, I think, the Gate was my first cult. I think it was the first one I was really aware of, 1997. So,
1997 is when the group, the vast majority of the remaining group members killed themselves. So this is when we heard about them on the news in like a major way.
So I have two images in my head associated with Heaven's Gate. One is the Black Nikes with the white swoosh on all of the news coverage in the shots, the practice shots of the cows. And then the other is the website. So this is the tap. I remember this is early internet. Once we were like, do I live in their website as a kid? And so it's like, for me, I was, because like, I was finishing up my seventh grade. I was like,
I bet the website appeals to you because I know you like neon. I know you're a fan of neon, and it's got a lot of neon. It's got a lot of bright colors.
I do like the website. I don't like the shade about my design choices.
It wasn't shade. It was a compliment. It was actually, which is going to be a theme with me. I mean, and I feel strange having to say from the outset, I am not defending. I do not endorse the actions of the, which seems like a weird thing to say. So I listened to a Heaven's Gate podcast. Glenn Washington does it. It's really good. And at the beginning, he says, I think he gives a good description of the way that we've received a narrative about Heaven's Gate. And he says it was just so awful, and it would have been unwatchable if the sadness weren't punctuated with so much weird. And I think that like that weird stereotype is one that really lingers, and I just don't think, so while I do not endorse their actions, I also don't think that they're that weird if we put them in context of early internet, 90s, and in their beginnings, which was in the 70s. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Can I say where I was in 1997? Where were you in 1997? Oh, I didn't. Right. I mean, I don't have a particularly interesting story about. I was 16 in 1997, so I remember really well the news coverage as well. And I hear what you're saying about like how it gets kind of uh, absorbed into this larger media scene of American radicalism of one kind or another, like these just sensational stories. Um, but I was, because I was a broody teenager, I was also reeling from Kurt Cobain's death still at the time, because that happened 3 years earlier. So the '90s were complicated for me. That wasn't on your radar yet. I mean, tangent, but when on the day that Kurt Cobain died at my school, like they let us like leave class and go outside for a minute just so that we could all kind of process, which makes my school sound way cooler than it actually was, but they did give us that time. Stop. Let them have their moment. Let them have their t-shirts, Michael. Okay, so if you have not seen Heaven's Gate Cult of Cults, it's a 4-part series on HBO. I just want to give like a little synopsis if you haven't seen it, or if I don't know, maybe in 1997 you were 2 years old, maybe you weren't even born yet. Who can say? We're going to talk about their beginnings in this first part, so we're going to split it into like the first 2 episodes for this conversation, and then the second conversation we're going to talk about the last part. We're going to talk about their beginnings. They were around for 20 years, but then in 1997, the majority of the remaining members, 39 people, they were all in a big house in Rancho Santa Fe, and they took phenobarbital and vodka in shifts. There were 15 and then 15 and then 9, but it was 39 people was, and I believe remains, the largest mass suicide in U.S. history, like on U.S. soil. But suicide was not part of the original plan. The message that like what they believed in was that once every 2,000 years, there's a level above human. They called it the next level, which is like outer space, but also I guess what people would think of as heaven. And every 2 years it opens its gate, right? Heaven's Gate, and lets you in. And there were 2 leaders who became known as T and Doe, Bonnie Lou Nettles and Marshall Applewhite. And they introduced themselves as God's messengers, the 2 that are talked about. I think it's Matthew, right? It's in Revelation. That makes sense. There's talk in the Bible of like these 2 messengers that are going to be sent to earth. And like what's their job? Do you know? You're my like resident Bible expert. Yes. Yes. So that's T and Doe. Like they went on a little quest themselves to figure out what exactly they believed, and this was the vision that they had. This was the message that they said that they received. They start telling people, spreading the message, we've been sent from the next level to tell you that you have an opportunity and you can join us on a UFO, like in a very, literal physical way, and you can come with us to the next level. They believed in reincarnation, so you would have another chance, but you'd have to, wait 2,000 years. So, and in that sense, though, too, I said suicide was never part of the original plan. The part of what they were talking about as well is like you don't have to die in order to go to heaven. You get just on a spaceship and you get to enter it in physical form, because your body will be like transformed from a human to a next level figure. Mm-hmm. is when they got their beginning. Yes. 75 is when they had a really important meeting in Oregon that then made the news. Like there's a clip of Walter Cronkite in the documentary saying like 20 people disappeared. Um, mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to give some context for what I mean about the group not being particularly way far removed from stuff that was happening socially and civically at the time. Because, like we said, they're coming out of it's a post hippie movement USA. It's like Vietnam protests and social uprisings and all sorts of upheavals that are happening are leaving lots of folks looking for meaning, searching for answers, and such that. Here, I'm just going to list a couple of popular books at the time. From 1968, there was a book called Chariots of the Gods. This was by Eric von Daniken. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but he talked about how ancient religions, this is like his origin story for how ancient religions came to be. They were like founded by aliens and extraterrestrial astronauts who like came to Earth and passed themselves off as gods. That book was made into a documentary in 1970, dubbed into English in 1973, and that documentary was nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary Feature. Meanwhile, a couple of years later in 1970, the late great, and also around the time that documentary is being made, Late Great Planet Earth is by Hal Lindsey.
Yeah.
This is the best-selling nonfiction.
The best nonfiction book ever.
I mean, have you read it? Best-selling nonfiction book of the 1970s, and it was a millenarian project. Heaven's Gate was. Their ideas involved this in-time speak, but was heavily leaning on scriptural references from the Bible. Jesus and God were very much the same figures of, mainstream Christians, but they were adding this space element and UFOs and aliens. But again, that wasn't so weird. So with Chariots of the Gods, we get aliens and extraterrestrial astronauts. And with Late Great Planet Earth, we've got Lindsay comparing end-time prophecies in the Bible, like stacking those up with current events from the time to predict the scenarios that would result in the rapture and the second coming of Jesus. That Late Great Planet Earth was featured on a primetime television special that featured Hal Lindsey. That's mid-70s. That audience was 17 million people, and it was adapted into a film in 1978 that was narrated by Orson Welles. This is the kind of level of access that these ideas have. We're talking Orson Welles and the Oscars.
Well, and I was also thinking, like, I was trying to look up, like, Thief in the Night and all of those, like, in mainstream evangelicalism.
I don't know what that is. I know it in mainstream. What's Thief in the Night?
So for mainstream evangelicalism is what we talked about.
Can I tell you what I know, though, real fast? I know that Kirk Cameron was, like, after his teen heartthrob years on, what was he on? Full House?
No, not Full House. It was earlier than Full House.
All right, now you're going to have to edit that. Sorry.
Growing Pains? Growing Pains.
Yes.
That was no internet. That was pure
Recall.
Legal trivia.
Recall. So I know that Kirk Cameron was on like a Left Behind kind of thing.
Yeah.
Is it in that vein?
Yeah, it was A Thief in the Night was a 1973 Christian horror film.
Oh.
about the second coming. Yeah. I remember, Well, then I was just thinking that this was a thing it was just sort of in the water. Catherine Albanese, the historian of religion in America, argued that like apocalypticism, end times, millenarianism, whatever, is the like uniquely American like fascination. That it's
Why?
something
Like,
sort of-
what reason does she give?
she gives a number. I mean, I think a lot of it is is the kind of new world status. I mean, from the beginning, I always tell, when I tell students about like the first times, Spanish explorers show up in the new world, it's like, imagine you got on a ship and landed on Mars, because that's what
Yeah,
they were thinking, right?
sure.
So I think a lot of that comes with it. Jonathan Edwards, the famous preacher in the colonial period, was talked about the end times are going to start in America. Mormonism, which we haven't talked about, is kind of built on a kind of American.
There are several documentaries we can
Yeah,
watch.
we'll get there. We will get there.
Christian eschatology, which immerses itself in this like discourse on end times, is nothing new. If it's distinctly American, as you're saying, and if it was present in distinctly American contexts since Jonathan Edwards,
Yeah.
and if it tracked into something so contemporary as Kirk Cameron,
Right. Yeah.
I figured that Thief in the Night was like a recent thing, but no,
No,
it was in the
no,
70s.
70s. Yeah.
So-
it was like around and on into the 90s. You'd get a VHS tape and pop that bad boy in and make the kids watch it.
Yeah, so like it's not. I mean, just theologically or ideologically, it's not too far out there. What's like, I guess, literally and figuratively out there is the UFO stuff that Heaven's Gate incorporated. But that wasn't weird in the late 60s and early 70s at all. And then even as they're getting into the 90s, that's Star Trek Next Generation land.
Yeah.
And we'll
Yeah.
talk about that next episode because I have things to say about Star Trek Next Generation. I love it so much.
Oh,
But it's okay. So that was the like
yeah.
cultural context of like what pop nonfiction was doing.
Yeah.
The airport books at the time.
I mean, Star Wars is happening.
Star Wars is happening at the time. So there's an essay that I like very much. It was written not long after the 39 folks died in 1997. And it was originally written as a chronicle of higher education opinion piece. It's by Mark Musey, who's a religion professor. And I think where I got it from is from our colleague Russell McCutcheon's lovely volume about the insider-outsider problem in the study of religion. But Musey is talking about Heaven's Gate in a kind of comparative way with mainstream Christianity. His main point in the essay is talking about the role of religious studies as an academic discipline being to make the strange familiar and to make the familiar strange.
Yeah.
And what he means by that is like, we look at this group and we think how weird, how wacky, how totally like out there because they all wore the same shoes or whatever. But if we really start to peel back some layers, we can see that there's not that much that
Right.
is so completely different from things that we take for granted as just regular parts of religious traditions. So
So much of the weirdness is just like aesthetics.
yeah,
In a lot of ways.
because so some of the examples that he gives are the fact that they were sexually chaste,
Right.
and we're even going to the point of like kind of emphasizing a certain level of gender neutrality. Everybody cut their
Yeah.
hair really short, but that's a thing that lots of people incorporate into their religious beliefs. Certainly is the case with cloisters and monasteries of
Yeah.
anyway. The another example he gives is the role of the comet. Like when they passed in 1997, they were very much of the belief that they were going to remove themselves from their vehicles, their bodies, and ascend to the next level by way of the spaceship that we talked about a little bit ago. That spaceship was on coming in the wake of, in the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet.
Right.
Which everybody was paying attention to at the time. But Musey talks about the fact that signs from the heavens, looking for stuff happening in the stars, is also nothing new. Like you can
No,
date.
yeah.
I mean,
Well, and the prevalence of astrology,
yeah,
and someone I don't know of a good like history of astrology in America, but the presence of astrology, T was like into astrology before she met
yes,
Doe, and so you have like that whole piece of it. And I mean, I think you're right, because if you're like, these people are they're celibate, they don't smoke, and they don't drink.
Yep.
I'm like, they're Southern Baptists, right? I mean, but then you have, like you said, the
Right.
gender thing and the haircuts and all that stuff that stands out.
but common dress and kind of a uniform appearance is certainly nothing that we bat an eye at if we're looking at nuns walking down the street.
Right.
So where we draw those lines is something that Musey asks us to pay attention to. And thinking about the stuff that we find strange and familiar, and like comparing it to something that we think is really familiar or really like something that we take for granted is an important exercise as we think about social groups, religious or otherwise. And then also, thinking about the stuff that we do take for granted and kind of defamiliarizing that. Like if put in a different context, how many thousands of things that I do would seem completely weird.
So is your reading of the documentary that it's missing? Do you read it as emphasizing the weird, or do you read it as trying to normalize it? Because Ben Zeller
Yep.
at one point says like, oh, they were a Christian, it was an offshoot of Christianity, which feels like a move to bring them closer. But a lot of the shots you get in the documentary, especially in these first two episodes about the 70s, are all of these headlines about like UFO cult or
Yes.
and these Walter Cronkite and all these things. So what is your reading? What is your reading of the way the documentary is dealing with this?
So, I mean, we're only a few episodes in, so I don't want to speak too far into the future, but something that I think we should pay attention to is, just what kind of balance these documentaries are trying to strike. Because I think like a lot of documentary motivations, there is at least a stated desire, an implicit one, to represent both sides, to listen to someone like Ben Zeller talking about, it's an offshoot to Christianity, but then also to listen to, is it Jana? Is it Yana? How do we say her name? Lalish. I know how to say her last name. Who is a sociologist?
Yes.
Who is pretty dismissive throughout as she talks about them, and and she kind of like chuckles as she says, "I think that they were on acid," and I like and just automatically goes to like this is what happens in cults, and then like brings out those features. So the same thing happens with, we have two people who were in the group who are still around. Sawyer is still a true believer. He's still looking for messages from T and Doe.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, Frank Lyford talks about how he's super angry at the 18 years that he feels like he wasted in the group. He'll emphasize elements that he thought were really controlling.
Yeah.
So I think that there is an attempt, anyway, at giving sort of a point counterpoint.
Yeah.
But I don't know that, like, I think that when you name something Heaven's Gate, the cult of cults, like that phrase is something that Marshall Applewhite said at one time in one of his recordings, in one of his teaching videos. If that's the one thing, because we've got lots of stuff that he says.
Yes,
and if
he
that's
said
what,
a lot and recorded all of it.
Yeah, and after that, like he was like, I mean, based on how we think about groups and piety and like we're the cult of cults, we're the cult of truth is what he follows that immediately up with. And so if you are pulling out from all of the recordings that we have from this group and you have cult of cults and you put that in the title, I kind of think like the vibe that I get is sort of how if you're going to a zoo exhibit or some kind of space where you are necessarily like stacked up to gawk at something.
Yeah.
And then here's your little like informational pamphlet or whatever about, let me explain what you're looking at, you know, and
Yeah.
here's what their habits are. And here's, you know, they feed during nocturnal hours or they do whatever. So you get this context, but you're also there to look at this thing that is
Right.
weird. You
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
And so I think that at least,
There's no squirrels at the zoo.
yeah.
I mean, there's squirrels at the zoo, but they're not labeled. They're just running around.
Right. And so our emphasis on trying to do so much explaining, I think, is itself work that happens only in relation to stuff that we think is weird.
Right.
You
yeah.
know?
I mean, you could easily have pulled and called it, you know, Heaven's Gate reaching the next level, or Heaven's Gate,
Yeah.
you know, the path to heaven or whatever. I
Right.
mean, there's all sorts of things, right?
Right.
Like,
The truth is out there. That's their context. That is who they are for 20 years, is an offshoot of Christian theology, end times eschatological thinking, and some astrological UFO space stuff. And the triangulation of those is a general nutshell of what they believed. But if we think about it in terms of when they were espousing all of this, I think it makes a lot of sense. Marshall Applewhite and Bonnie Lou Nettles take on names, titles. Like originally they were known as the Two because of those two messengers in Revelation. Then they were Bo and Peep because, you know, I guess like they are shepherds of a flock,
yeah.
which is also common
They were,
rhetoric.
they were finding the lost sheep of the mid 70s, of which there were a lot, apparently.
And then because Marshall Applewhite is coming from a musical background, and because Bonnie Lou Nettles' like favorite film is The Sound of Music, they really kind of land on Do and T, these fundamental elements of what builds
Yeah.
song. So Do and T are the names that they use, the titles that they use, and they are creating a community that is very insular. Like that is one of the things that I think people point to as quote unquote cult behavior, because everyone is asked to leave aside their earthly trappings. And while that is certainly nothing strange, it does mean that they have very little to no contact with their families for some of them for a long, long time. But others are in touch-ish, but not. So there is this kind of separation from people that they love, and that's of course like devastating for their families. They are a functioning group for about 10 years, and then T has cancer. She gets cancer and she dies. One of the people that we hear from is Terry, her daughter, who doesn't find out for 9 months after the fact. So that's an example of just how. And
I think it's interesting that the way Doe tells her is like by sending her a recording of him.
Sends her an audio cassette.
Yeah.
And we hear him cry in the audio. When T dies, that is not a time when Doe is like, okay, next steps. He's devastated.
Yeah.
And by all accounts, it's a real rug getting pulled out from under him, because T was really who he looked to. Everybody got a check partner that hung out and just made sure that, like, you know, an accountability partner.
Yeah.
And
again, just like Southern Baptists, they just don't meet at like Chick-fil-A at 6 a.m.
really,
it's not uncommon. It's not uncommon to have an accountability buddy.
I need a pamphlet with
An accountability. I don't know why Southern Baptists are my go-to comparison for all of these, but
Well, because it's something that's familiar to
Right.
you,
I was not Southern Baptist, for the record.
right, but like you know
Yeah.
what I mean, like the things that are closer to home that you can identify elements from, and then do this sort of comparative work. So T is Doe's. I mean, he really looks to her for leadership and for his own development. And he's really devastated. So he has to regroup and figure out what to do. And at the time, according to Sawyer, he's really questioning whether or not he even wants to continue the class. Maybe Frank Lyford also says that. But the people who were former group members talk about how the extent to which he was reeling. And that was also a time that he lets members travel home
Yeah.
and visit with their families. So it was a very insular group, make no mistake. People left their families, and that was really, really hard. But by all accounts, what there wasn't was a kind of coercive environment wherein there were threats about what would happen if you try to leave.
Right.
There
right.
was not a kind of fear for my physical safety if I want to leave the group. It was just a lot of, which is not to say that exploitation and manipulation can't happen in that kind of context. But what it is to say is the typical narrative that we have when we think about insular religious groups is not really a script that they followed.
Yeah, we don't have, if we think about it in terms of the other two documentaries we looked at, we don't have any of the kind of like labor problems, right? Of like people just volunteering their time to do stuff that makes somebody else a crap ton of money. You know, what was interesting to me was how kind of poor everybody was. Like they're living in campgrounds, they're traveling around. Like this is not here are all of the cult peons making money for
Right.
the head honcho at all.
Now they will go on, many of them, to have jobs and work them, but they will and they will like sign out of a log to say like when they're coming, when they're going. Like there is that sort of regimented thing, but they also wrote down all of the finances because it was this kind of communal pot. And what is absolutely the case is certainly Doe and T were not like living large while
No, yeah.
the rest of them were.
Yeah.
You know.
It makes me, I mean, all right, so quick. I'm going to put my history professor hat on for like 5 seconds.
Do it.
But, well, it made me, I hadn't thought about this during the documentary, but all this is made me think about in the 19th century, you had these two groups, the Oneida people and the Shakers, who we now know of as Oneida and silverware. I think I
Yes.
actually got Oneida silverware as a wedding gift. And then Shaker furniture, right? And these were like incredibly, they were all communal. They would sort of say socialist in the way that they understood it at the time. And also played with questions of gender, also played with androgyny and the representation of gender and sex in opposite ways. And then, but made a crap ton of money because the Shakers had awesome furniture and great tools and seeds they would sell. And Oneida had made a bunch of stuff that they sold, and to the point that even though they were driven out because of their marriage and sexual practices, they lived on as silverware, right? And so they were not exploitative in that way.
But they created their own kind of
Right.
insular economy.
Yeah, and were quite efficient. And it was the gender and sex practices that both kind of ran afoul of. I mean, the Shakers had trouble reproducing because they were celibate, and that's always hard.
But like also, I'll take. I mean, like as again, like as we are thinking of these stories and why and how we consume them and what it is we find so fascinating about them, I think that there would be real harm in placing on exactly the same level the idea of like failure to reproduce,
Yeah.
or in this case, we'll talk about it next time, but like some of the practices that they undertook to keep themselves chaste
Yeah.
in Heaven's Gate, alongside or on the same plane as Frank Houston
Right. or the
Or
sexual
his-
abuses in Shekinah Church. Yeah.
and so, or the sex abuses in the Catholic Church,
Right.
and so
Yeah.
I just, yeah.
There's a great part where I can't remember who it was, but somebody says, Jesus told his disciples to leave their families.
Which right.
Well, it's hard to have a comeback to that. Like, yeah, I don't know, but he didn't really mean it.
Right. And I don't, again, like I said from the outset, it's an awkward position to be like, this group is actually chill. That's not what I'm saying. And I'm not saying that like there aren't elements that really, hurt their families. But if you are someone as in this project, I mean, what I want to emphasize is what Musi emphasizes about this project of trying to make the strange familiar and the familiar strange. And so the harm that it caused to their families is that they loved their children and then they didn't hear from them for a long
Right.
time. And then in a couple of, in several dozen cases, they lost their kids or, mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, like these family members. But if you have a child who is this a messed up metaphor to use? Like, is joining the military because they are really into a cause and they believe in it and it is what they want to pattern their life out of. And then they get shipped overseas for years. And then maybe they get killed in combat. Like it's all part of the risk that in certain contexts we don't think of as manipulative fatality.
Yeah. I mean, you could almost think about divide some of these groups that get labeled as cults or just these high control religions, whatever you want to call it. You could divide them between the ones that are emphasizing a kind of carrot and the ones that are emphasizing a kind of stick. So it's like there was no, if you left, what you were leaving was you were missing out your chance to get to the next level.
That's right.
And you weren't even doomed to hell because within their own ideology, you're just going to circle back again for another 2,000 years, right? And so it wasn't like if you leave here, like you're shunned and you're going to go to hell, and like imparting that kind of like deep anxiety.
The thing that we heard from people in Shekinah about like I felt like I had to stay because my family's salvation was on my shoulders,
right? Yeah,
and so I put up with like sex abuses, because,
or the victim of Brian Houston, who's the survivor of Brian Houston, who said like my mom told me not to say anything and take down the pastor because then they'd be sending more people to hell, right?
Frank Houston, Frank Houston, but exactly.
So here it's just like this is your shot,
that's
right? And if you're willing to go through all this, which then you get in, and I think that it is important to kind of like make that distinction, and it's one that I think in the documentary, like I think Ben Zeller is trying to make that distinction in ways that other talking heads, Lalish, I think most obviously are not.
Which is not to say, I mean, like this is something I feel like we talk about in the classes we teach a lot. Like that kind of analysis is not to then create some conclusion of like this is good and this is bad, right?
Like I don't want my kids to join Heaven's Gate, right? Like I know I don't want that,
but you also don't want them to join a lot of groups that
true.
Would have nothing to do with religion, that would also,
right?
So I don't. It's not to say this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong. I mean, there are certain things that are very, very wrong, like obviously, but with this case, like it is what it is to say is there are all of these nuances that I think get absorbed into the vacuum of the category called cult, because as soon as you use that term, everything gets collapsed. As soon as this documentary series was released, there was a piece in AL.com, which, I love AL.com. It's our local newspaper, online newspaper, whose headline is 7 Creepy Things We Learned About, hang on, I'm looking it up. 7 creepy things we learned about cult leader and former UA teacher Marshall Applewhite. Like, I I think I think we should think about how the term cult keeps us from paying attention to certain things,
Right.
and how it asks us to pay attention to other things. So anyway, Doe, when T dies, this is 1985. So the group has been around for about a decade, and at that point, there is this kind of regrouping and reckoning. And that's when the theology starts to change a little bit. It's when they have to now kind of figure out how to explain that death because that it doesn't really work with what they were saying originally about their vehicles and next level
Right.
presence. So the documentary talks a little bit about that and the kind of rhetorical gymnastics that they do to make this happen. I think significantly, it is important to know that when everybody was sent home to just kind of hang with their families a little bit while Doe was, trying to figure his own stuff out, only one person stayed. Everybody else came back.
Yeah. Which is
Yeah.
an example of, I think, this question that gets asked early in episode 1, about midway through perhaps, but the idea of like, why did these people believe this? Right.
Right.
And no one can give a good answer. It just kind of hangs there
Sure.
the whole time. And
Sure.
it's, I think, Reza Aslan tries to take a swing at it at one point, but the idea that like no one has a really, really, I think a good answer to why. And so when someone comes back after this, it's like, okay, they left and they came back. They really must believe this, whatever that means. And so what does that mean?
And next time we're going to the third episode begins with a conversation about brainwashing. So we're going to talk about that a lot in part 2, because I want to think about brainwashing, something called brainwashing, in relation to something that we call like sincerely held beliefs, which we use a lot in all sorts of contexts, legislative among others, and juridical. Anyway, T dies. Doe has to regroup. When the group comes back, that's when there is like a shift, and that's when people start noticing a shift. That's when Frank Lyford says that Doe became more controlling. This is also when I think it's Zeller who tells us that that's when he calls himself or identifies himself, Doe, as Jesus returned to earth, and then like T is God the Father. The group starts they buy gold bands and perform this kind of ceremonial marriage ritual to Doe and inside the group to kind of cement their insularity. So we're going to talk about that next time, the shift that happens. I do think for this initial conversation, it's important to start making the strange familiar and familiar strange. What did you pull out in your own watching of the first 2 episodes? What else should we talk about?
I have one. I just had a thing.
Yeah.
Well, before I talk about what I want to talk about, I want to talk about something else. So
Okay.
I guess
Great.
I'm always curious, but do we know if? Because I've only really watched the documentary. I haven't. You are the one who's done the deep dive, read the liner notes.
I've read some liner notes, but I'm
got the DLC bonus content. But do we know, did the marriage thing got me thinking about another quote unquote cult, the Unification Church, which was also a 70s thing.
Yep.
To what extent? I'm wondering. We think of these groups as sort of offshoots of mainstream. This was one of the earliest ways that sociologists classified them, was church, sect, cult, and so they were connected to some mainstream church or whatever. And so we see them as sort of isolated from one another.
The Unification Church, quick pause to say that, for those of you listening, if you're not familiar with the Unification Church, they're popularly known as the Moonies.
Right. Yeah. And they have this huge mass wedding ceremony they do. And so I'm was I wondering if Applewhite is seeing are cults watching other cults, or they just is this just, I don't know. I have no answer.
Do you know when
for
that
this.
ceremony happened? That's what you're looking up.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that it was.
Ooh, their Wikipedia page is long.
Yeah.
Somebody did some research.
I definitely know that it was happening in the 80s and 90s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in the United States. So I don't know.
Yeah.
Homework assignment for listeners. If you know anything about this, somebody out there. Most of the people listening to these early episodes know us anyway, so you can find it. So yeah, what I want to talk about, I have a couple things. I'm thinking about the documentary itself, like as a kind of document, as a kind of production. So I keep trying to identify tropes because I feel like we talked about with the 7M TikTok cult last episode that was sort of the white girl in peril trope we see, and then I think here we have there's the brainwashing trope we'll talk about more in the next episode, but you also have the hometown visit. So like I think in a lot of these stories there's this like. And it's a useful plot point of like, well, they could have all gotten out here. So they went home. But instead what happens is
and just like a point of juxtaposition.
Right.
Like, yeah.
And so like in Dancing with the Devil, Miranda goes home, but is like, well, we have the Instagram home visit and then we have the Christmas visit with her sister very pissed off in the video they make. And then, so here we have the hometown visit again, right?
That's so interesting though that you mentioned the Instagram live visit because I hadn't made that connection. A lot of what we do see from Heaven's Gate are these really tender home movies that they make.
Yes.
And we see clips, for example, from Nancy Brown, who's the mother of her son joined Heaven's Gate, and she put together this parents network pretty early on in the group to share information. And so she really missed her son, right? But when he comes home, so when he comes home, there are these videos and it's this kind of togetherness. She will talk about in the podcast series about how when she sees these videos of the group, while it doesn't bring her son back and while she misses him terribly, she's also really glad that he had community like that. Like she talks about what she recognizes in the joy among nerds. Like that was what they're nerds hanging out. They do a talent show before that. Like they watch Sound of Music a bunch. They are Trekkies. Anyway, so like I didn't think about the video that we see when David returns home and we see him and Nancy and his other family members versus Miranda's live Instagram. So like the video is its own hostile character in
the audience of Instagram. This is I'm here with my Instagram audience.
Yeah. Anyway.
No, but I think actually what you're saying gets to my sort of, and I'll use it to the segue. The role of technology in Heaven's Gate in particular, whether it's, I mean, they filmed so much, and the videos that Applewhite makes, the videos of all of the meetings in the 70s, there's just this. They are a kind of, they're as much a analog video cult as they are anything else. And I think it's kind of like that part of me, that part is so fascinating to me because there is this assumed audience for all of this, right? And whether it's the class or someone else, or I don't, and I think we don't hear a lot about that side of it in these first two episodes, but it's all kind of evident, and it makes me wonder to what extent Heaven's Gate has gotten so much purchase in American culture and in the kind of shared zeitgeist or whatever you want to call it, because it was so easily transmittable, and they had a website that is still up, right?
Analog video makers, but also early adopters of internet.
Yeah, and I mean it's
internet technology.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting, I think, to think about how much their adoption of video and their adoption of technology kind of paves the way for what we think of as a cult, like a cult leader produces media.
Yeah.
A lot of the times, in the kind of trope.
It's like what you were saying about much of what we recognize is aesthetic. Like, I mean, the group, at least, from their videos, certainly seems like a group of good-hearted nerds, but they are also very much users of mainstream societal stuff and tapping into that. I mean, the fact that I mentioned to someone the other day what he was asking what episode we were about to work on, and I said Heaven's Gate, and he was like, "Which one is Heaven's Gate?" Oh, they're the one with the Nikes, right?
Yeah,
And that's
how
what
I
you,
always, yeah,
I
the
know.
Nikes, yeah.
And so, I mean, and Nike like discontinued that specific model of sneaker. I mean,
did not know that.
Unsurprisingly, like not long after the suicide.
Wow.
But what is more recognizable and mainstream than a Nike? Just the
Yeah.
fact that
Yeah.
they like we're shedding our earthly trappings, but we're also keeping down jobs, and we're watching Star Trek, and we buy Nikes, and we use the internet. Like, it's just, yeah, it's
Well, and I
fascinating.
think so. And then the other trope that I see in this is language. So again and again in these documentaries, the groups there's an emphasis by the filmmakers on the way these groups adopt new language, and then specifically. Sawyer talks about this at one point, the way that new language shapes your thinking. So your body becomes a vehicle, and there's that long kind of glossary they go over of all the different terms that become new. And I think
Their names themselves also
Right.
always end
Yes.
in OD,
the
ODY.
yeah, which is I found oddly adorable. I don't know. There's this idea that language is somehow kind of a stable shared thing in a society.
Yeah.
And so when someone starts screwing around with the meanings of words, that is nefarious. And one of the shows that I rewatch, despite it has a few flaws, but I think it holds up overall, is Cougar Town. I don't know if you've seen this show. I love this
Do you
sitcom.
think I've seen that show?
Well, it's better. The title is
I have
not
not
the
seen that
point.
show.
Okay. Anyways, it's by the same guy who did like
But if you have
Scrubs.
some prestige television you want to talk about later, I'm your person.
Yeah, I don't. I have no prestige.
Anything on the Criterion Collection you want to talk about?
But in Cougar Town, there's a bit where they keep changing the names of the meanings of words. So someone will be like, "That's no cakewalk." They're like, "Actually, walking around holding a cake would be really hard. Cakewalk should be hard." And then the guy's like, "You can't just change the names." He's like, "Change it." I feel like that is this like, right? You can just like change the meaning.
I hope then they had a like cut to someone actually talking about the history of cakewalk. But anyway,
No,
we'll leave that.
they
Yeah, we'll
definitely
leave that alone.
didn't.
We'll leave that
This is
alone.
about rednecks in Florida.
Sure.
Um,
That's also a problematic term, Mike. We can talk about it later.
I think I have the social location from which to use the term redneck.
If you're an insider, then you get to mess with language.
Yes, exactly.
true.
No, true. As a, yeah,
Yeah.
I'm claiming I can use
You can
redneck.
claim that. Okay. But yeah, I mean, you're right. And it's not something that's overt or something that I think people are being really strategic about when they find themselves unsettled by the transformation of certain kinds of language or the retooling of different words. But that's a really good point, that like when words start getting messed with, because that's something that we've internalized to such a degree that then if you're messing with language, you're also messing with reality. And that's not
Yeah.
okay, right? Are we ready for takeaways?
What are our takeaways?
Okay. I mean, well, what's your takeaway? You go first.
My takeaway is for the audience of these shows, it's always implicitly comparative. They're always like, who do I identify? Like, apparently I identified with Carl Lentz, right? But who do we identify with in this thing?
Stories have characters.
Right.
Yeah.
And then there's always this back and forth comparison, right? Between like, well, they did this thing that it's only weird because we're constantly comparing it to what is normal to us. And so what's I think really interesting about these documentaries is that because people have a variety of religious experiences that they're bringing to the table, those comparative moves are always going to be very different, right? With this race for me in this documentary, because of the emphasis on the families, like so on Terry Nettles' and the daughter, and then all of the family members and the family network, but then also all that footage that we talked about and the stories about the inside and the way that like Sawyer talks about his time in the group. It raises this idea that like really I think a lot of these documentaries are actually produced to be about families. They're about like, what is a family? What is the requirements of a family? What does it mean to be in a family? Can you make your own family? What happens when you choose a different family? What happens when families are toxic? Like, and so I think for me at the end of these first two episodes that lead up to kind of, you know, especially the way it ends with T's death and how that affects both her daughter and Doe and the group.
Yep.
And then the hometown visits and the fact that they all come back. It was just like, you know, this is really about these sort of family relationships, whether that's a sort of a hereditary family or otherwise. And so, yeah, that was sort of my takeaway from this.
I like it. Yeah, that's a really good point. Mine is to do with the strange, familiar, strange thing. I mean, that's really what my brain keeps circling around as I think about Heaven's Gate. And so I'm very grateful, Mark Musey, for that essay that you wrote 30 years ago. I appreciate it. So for me too, like in that vein, I think that we'd be well served to be more self-aware about how we respond socially to broad scale anxiety, because I think that the way that lots of people respond to those kinds of contexts look really weird in times that are outside of that context, where there are different anxieties, where there aren't the same kinds of media that are circulating. And one of the ways that we respond socially to broad scale anxiety is to look for community, to insulate. I mean, we we learned that with COVID lockdown. You know? And one of the ways that we insulate and form community sometimes involves, at least as it did with Heaven's Gate, a lot of self-editing. And I'm still kind of thinking about that and grappling with the role of self-editing, because I think it's another thing that's different about this group as opposed to the ones that we tend to identify under the cult umbrella as someone just like getting like, here's my theology that I'm going to share so that I can get what I want out of you. This was a like, here's what we all need to give up so that we can all achieve next level consciousness.
But what do you do about T saying all of that, but still writing her daughter?
We'll talk about it. Yeah. No, I mean, well,
yeah.
Well, I don't.
That's both takeaways in one. That's family and.
Oh yeah, that was a good circle. That was a good segue.
Full
Circling
circle.
back. Yes.
Should we do cult favorites?
Yeah, let's go.
Is that it? Cult favorites?
I just dropped something.
Uh-oh.
Okay. Should we do cult favorites?
What's your cult favorite, Mike?
What's my cult favorite?
Dropping things.
My cult favorite is breaking.
Knocking stuff
is
off the
knocking stuff off this table. This is why we don't have a YouTube episode, because it's just wires everywhere.
Yet. Anyway. Go ahead.
One day we're still in our we're in our 1970s nomadic stage as a podcast where we have yet to settle. We've yet to settle back in our building.
Oh my God. It's the summer, y'all. So we are recording this outside of the context of a regular semester, and so it does feel a little bit nomadic and searching, doesn't it?
Yeah,
we're outside of our regular home,
which is why my cult favorite is very local. It's very spatial. It's very community. And for those of you who do not live in Tuscaloosa, you won't be able to experience it, but you should find something similar. That would be, for me, it's
come visit
Druid City Brewing Company, which is a local brewery and tap room and place that has trivia and has retro video games and has a Tuesday night happy hour special on barbecue sandwiches that I can feed my children and get a beer while they play Mario on an old Nintendo that's plugged into an old TV that somebody found.
Speaking of 90s nostalgia.
Yeah.
Was Mario around in the 90s? I don't even know.
Yeah, 80s and
thought
90s.
so,
They have everything. They have like the original Nintendo, they have Super Nintendo, they have Nintendo 64 all the way through. But yeah, it's a lovely place. Bo, the guy who owns it, is excellent. Shout out to Bo Hicks. This isn't the first podcast to shout out Bo Hicks, but and they have good beer, and like it's one of those places. This is what my real, like, I guess this is my cult favorite for anyone out there who doesn't live in this town, is just a place that if you go there, you're gonna see one person you know that you like, not just someone you know. There's plenty of places around here I can run into somebody I know, but somebody I know that would be like happy to see them.
You mean a bar where everybody knows your name?
Yes.
I think there's a whole show about that. I think that concept is one that has traction. That seems like it's got
but
purchased.
it wasn't.
If there's not a show, we should make one.
Right. But isn't Heaven's Gate just a bar where everyone knows your name and it ends in Odie?
I mean, yeah.
What's your cult favorite?
Okay, I have two. I'll be really quick because this is, I guess, going back to my own brand of 90s nostalgia. So my first one is the new Slater-Kinney album called Little Rope. I love it so much. I've been listening to it nearly nonstop. And they came to, and they're on tour again, which makes me so happy. So like 90s Miranda looking for some place to retreat outside of, school dynamics. Slater-Kinney was a refuge. And they're back. And so they came to New Orleans. I went to see them in New Orleans, and I'm about to go to Nashville to see them again. And I'm just like inhabiting my full fangirl-ness.
That's awesome.
And yeah, so go listen to Little Rope. And my other cult favorite right now in this moment is sentence diagramming.
Ooh.
I will spare all of you the sordid details of how and why it is I like sentence diagramming. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe I won't at some point. But I've been doing a lot of it. Maybe that's my own way of managing anxiety. It's kind of like a complicated connect the dots or something.
Talk about language being stable.
Well,
language.
Right. So the thing is, I've been diagramming a lot of sentences, and because it like kind of calms my brain and makes it think that it can do math. But it's, grammar rules are arbitrary and stupid. They are totally infused with all sorts of power dynamics that are completely uncool. But there's also something I think I think that they make like pretty pictures, but they also like are very anti-essentializing in a certain way, because no word is ever a thing in itself. What a diagram is that it shows a word's relationship to other words. And so it's like this part of speech isn't always going to be, if you have this infinitive, like that's not going to be always doing the same thing in a diagram, because it depends on whether, like, is it being used as a noun?
Are these color coded?
Sometimes.
I'm like, I think this is something you could like.
Not always.
You could do these, and there's a market for these.
I have plans. I don't know that there's a market. I don't think that there's a market, but it's just something I'm enjoying right now.
There's a market for it.
Well, thanks, bud. We'll see.
Or at least there's an Instagram for this. You could do.
I'm just happy to let it give my brain a break.
How do you find the sentences?
Oh, well, so sometimes I'll just do sentences that I like find really felicitous that I like a lot, and then I'll just diagram them as like a little ode to like, hey, sentence, I think you're pretty. But a friend and I have actually been pulling out sentences that are really like kind of messed up, like politically, ideologically, things that spout ideas that we really find problematic.
Can I start sending you professional wrestling promos
for
you
God,
to
yeah.
diagram?
10,000%.
I need you to diagram
I'm
the
here for
Steiner
you.
math. I'm
I'm
going to send
here
you the
for you.
Steiner math
Yes,
promo. Okay.
I'm here for you. So I Yes, I'm also kind of I'm finding it like a good way to deal with a lot of the political rhetoric that's swirling around that I don't have control over, but that really like makes me feel anxious and jittery and kind of terrified.
Yeah.
So, or just generally angry. So having some kind of tiny little micro control over what to do with those sentences and then seeing why they're so messed up rhetorically and structurally.
They're wrong in
Somehow
so
helps.
many ways.
Anyway, that's my cult favorite.
Thanks, Miranda. Thanks for listening to Cult Favorite. Join us. You can subscribe to the podcast on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And when you subscribe, be sure to leave us a rating and a review. You can also follow us on X or Twitter or whatever we're calling that now, or on Instagram at Cult Favorite Pod.
Yeah, we dig feedback. We are receptive. We take special requests. So DM us. It's like an emphatic thing. It has to be an emphasis on a DM us. Or like leave a comment on Spotify. Whatever works for you. You follow your feedback bliss. And thanks, Department of Religious Studies at UA. We're looking forward to being back since we're in the summer of this nomadic existence. So thanks for production assistance to Department of Religious Studies at the University of Alabama. And we'll see you next time.